Hey friends, Nerdy Pastor back here to do the second part of two parts of a video that covers the life and theology of William G.T. Shedd. And I did the first part of his life, kind of a very brief biographical sketch of him, as his work spanned over a history of about 80 years, a little give or take, and had three institutions. He was a professor of multiple disciplines, kind of a true Renaissance man, and an important part of the American Presbyterian experience and theology in North America. And a very important theologian, and most of his works have been republished in the last 20 years, and there's a number of even recent monographs that have been written about his theology. One that I discussed with you last time by Oliver Crisp, a theologian out in Fuller Seminary, and kind of a more of a novel, critical scholar, not a conservative Presbyterian of any kind, but an important addition to the work of William Shedd nonetheless to consider. So I thought this video we would just talk a little bit about the theology of William G.T. Shedd and talk about briefly some of the works in publication that can be consulted as well. And talk about primarily the strengths of his writing, though there are some weaknesses in the sense of where he was more in the minority. That's not necessarily wrong. It's just some things to be observant of. But there are a few weaknesses in his writings that don't necessarily address the width of theology that systematic theologians typically do. But there's also, again, there's a pro and a con to how he addressed theological matters in his day. So Shedd essentially was a very conservative, we call him old Presbyterian or old light Presbyterian theologian, meaning that he focused primarily on faithfully subscribing to the Westminster Confession of Faith and holding that line of faithful theological conservative interpretation of Scripture throughout his ministry. And he was in the north, in the Northern Presbyterian segment of the church, so not traditionally a Southern Presbyterian, but lived in the New York, Massachusetts area for most of his life. But he was known as an old school Presbyterian, and we see that early on in his work, and we see it especially later on in his work. So there's a consistency of that across the board, but especially in the later controversies of the PCUS in the Northern Presbyterian Church. We see the many controversies about wanting to change the Westminster standards, and he pushed back pretty strongly against that. So if I could describe Shedd, he's an old school Presbyterian. However, he's also extremely philosophical, extremely, he's not novel, but he's somewhat speculative in traditional doctrines. So he's kind of a unique, very creative thinker, which I do think lends to some strength to his, though there is drawback sometimes with that as well, which might get him in the crosshair sometimes of in certain doctrines of what we want to hold more in the clarity of what the Scriptures teach instead of the specularity of what it might be. So that being said, I'll just introduce you to his writings as a whole. My goal is not to review all that, but to give you kind of the tenor of his theology and maybe a few particular areas of his theological enterprise as well. So first, he was a preacher, and a fantastic preacher, and you can tell by just reading his sermons. I can only imagine how powerful and illustrative and impactful they would have been hearing them. But he has 2 volumes of sermons that have been published by Solid Ground books, and also a wonderful volume on homiletics, which I have found extremely helpful in developing my own thoughts about preaching and the method of doing preaching. He has a lot to say that's very, very helpful. So those volumes are first Sermons to the Natural Man. You can see here, most of the sermons are about 20 to 25 pages, so there's some sustained length in them. These are evangelical messages, so evangelistic, preaching for conversion, preaching to people that are lost or folks that are lost that think they're found. And so these are sermons to the natural man. And again, they're organized nicely by text, like most sermon books are. And it talks about, again, the focus on sin and the need for grace, and it's going to keep focusing on that. Again, the preacher is not to be novel and creative in the sense of its their subject matter. They need to be creative in how they deliver it and how they preach it, but they don't need to be novel in the subject or the substance of it. So in one part, there is always to be an evangelistic character to sermons, because you're always preaching to natural people, meaning people that are non-converted, in a spiritual sense, but also spiritually dead, in internal sense. So there's a sense of needing to preach to the natural person who does not know God, cannot comprehend the things of God, and is living a life in the world. So a book of sermons to the natural man, and of course, another book of sermons that's been organized nicely by Solid Ground, Christian book distributor, on sermons to the spiritual man. And so again, these are more teaching in the teachings of living a life that is pleasing to God, following regeneration of the heart, conversion of the person from someone who is dead in sin to now who is alive to God in Christ. And these are sermons, again, that are organized fairly, by theme, and given a nice clarification on where these come from scripturally and where they're pulled from. So these are primarily sermons that come from the New Testament, but there are a handful of sermons that come from the Old. And then we also have the homiletics book in pastoral theology, which I found really, really helpful myself. And the only thing I disagree is probably because of my lack of ability with Dr. Shedd, is he always says that when you write a sermon, you need to write it in one sustained time. So I found in my own experience that happens from time to time, based upon clarity of thought and lucidity of purpose of the sermon and these other things. And I don't come to it like the way that he comes to it. The idea comes to me as I study the actual substance of the text, and the clarity of it grows as I meditate more and more and pray more and more and consider more and more. Even up to the last 10 minutes before I get up on stage sometimes. And so the reality is I can't really write sermons in that sustained way where you just kind of have a burst of spiritual power, is kind of how he talks about it, which again, maybe for those that are more attended by the grace of God, but that's certainly not me. I'm simply going to give it my best shot each day, and try to make a little bit more progress. And if it's all at once, that's great. But I don't try to demand myself to do that, because that's not, at least for me, natural in the way I go about it. So, but he's got some really powerful insights about preaching, and it comes really from that kind of sense of the Scottish common sense realism school of rationality. There's also some very illustrative thoughts about how to deliver the sermon based upon the personality of the preacher. But really, primarily, it's being tethered to the text. In your body, your style, your language needs to reflect the character, tone, and heartbeat of the text itself, not try to mold the text into you, which is very difficult because you are who you are. But I think there is a compromise of trying to say the goal is to deliver what the gist of the text is. And so, if I'm preaching from John 13 like I just did last Sunday, I'm not going to preach like I'm in Habakkuk chapter 3. It shouldn't sound like the same sermon in the sense of the tone and the delivery. Certainly the content to some level should be different. And I think he's trying to say, let yourself be molded more into the content and the character of the text than it to be, to you. And I think that's really important, because if it's a psalm of lament, you shouldn't be preaching hellfire. You know what I mean? Like, if it's about the new commandment of love, you should be filled with the love of God. Preaching the love of God, not preaching some sort of intense, fiery sermon. You should be preaching about the conviction about the love of Christ. And if you're preaching from Habakkuk 3, where Habakkuk's trembling in his boots, and his body is frail and coming underneath the mighty wrath of God that's to come, that's prophesied about the Babylonians coming upon the Israelites, you're probably going to deliver it kind of like a hurricane, So I think there's a sense of making sure that you're not molding the text into your personality, but letting your personality be compromised to some level to the personality of the text. So I really appreciate that, though the work is very, very hard to do that. But there's a lot of great direction from Dr. Shedd in preaching, and manifold examples of that as well from these 2 volumes of sermons. So you got a lot to work with there as well. Secondly, he's got a lot of works that are compendiums of sermons, of manuscripts that he wrote, articles he wrote that are really nicely compiled again by Solid Ground Christian Books into 4 volumes. He actually has also a commentary on Romans I haven't bought that they've done as well. I just haven't had the money to get that. But 2 volumes of Christian doctrine. And, he was in church history at Andover Seminary in Massachusetts for a little bit of time before he moved on into other disciplines. But he wrote a 2-volume history here of Christian doctrine. And it's always good to have, again, historical theology is a second-tier discipline, but it's a really important discipline that's often neglected by the local church. Often neglected. That's why I think the local church, more than anyone, is more susceptible to the currents of culture because they are not rooted in the history of the work of the Holy Spirit in the church. And Dr. Shedd, again, he's a magisterial theologian. He's also a church historian. And so he writes this 2-volume church history based upon his lectures as a church historian in the first seminary, I believe, in Andover that he worked at. Again, excuse me, I've got lots of allergies today. And then I've also found these little compendiums of his articles called Orthodoxy and Heterodoxy, really helpful. They're as short as 4 pages up to about 20. And then he's got some more sustained treatments from some articles he wrote called Theological Essays. That's very, very helpful as well. And he's got some real long sustained essays in here on, of course, the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement. He's got a long treatment on the evolutionary theories, of course, that were popularized, later in the 19th century by Darwin. And, we're coming out of kind of a tradition that was already going. So Darwin wasn't original with Darwin, but he certainly had some modifications to that materialism of his day and was certainly the popularizer in his book, The Origin of Species. But there's some sustained treatment of evolution. There's some sustained treatment here on Christian education. It's actually really, really good. And there's also a sustained article on the penal substitutionary atonement and the rational, kind of the logical inference of justice. Again, one of his greatest, just brightest strengths. Well, I'll talk about it in a second a little bit more. And again, for those of you that might be wondering, hey, what was that monograph you were talking about with Oliver Crisp? It's this book right here, The American Augustinian. And I found it pretty helpful because he really, of course, Crisp, he loves the novelty. That's what he kind of jumps in on, which is why he loves Jonathan Edwards as well. But so did William G.T. Shedd. Loved Jonathan Edwards because of the kind of speculative, novel, creative thinking there. However, there's still some fascinating treatment here of Shedd's theology in more of the areas that he is in the minority, on the realistic view of imputed sin, on different areas of just kind of how original sin works. Obviously, the tradition view of passing along sin through kind of more of the biological heredity. So he focuses in quite a bit on that, and of course he focuses in on Shedd's kind of popularizing of the Christ's atonement being sufficient for all, universal, yet only efficient or effective for some. So there's a limited atonement with a hypothetical kind of scope, but not hypothetical extent or intent. So again, he kind of engages that, as Chris always loves to engage with the novel thoughts within Reformed theology more often than the more traditional and the more, grounded thoughts. So again, very helpful in kind of uncovering some of that in Shedd. And there's other, of course, works in Shedd. You've got the eternal doctrine of eternal punishment. I've got that book back in my library, but it's essentially published in the Dogmatics. It's the same exact thing. So he prepared a number of his elements of the dogmatic theology, which I'll spend the last 5 minutes talking about, through writing that tome on the doctrine of endless punishment in the late 1880s or so, just a couple years before he published his first volume of the dogmatic theology. So originally the dogmatic theology was 2 volumes, and then he published a kind of an extended treatment with an indexing, I think, in 1894. So he kind of worked those 2 volumes toward the end of the 1880s, and then into 1890 he published an index with also some supplemental material. And then Alan Gomes published about 20 years ago a 1 volume through P&R here and put it all together as one, and it's so good. It's so well edited. There's so much supplemental material he adds. He gives clarification points. He gives a fantastic introduction to the person and work of William G.T. Shedd. Just fantastic way of just setting up the book, and I wish every volume of Systematics had that kind of care given to it, because it makes it so much more accessible and lively. It's really a gift from Dr. Gomes to all those who are trying to understand William Shedd. So let me just give you a very brief overview of kind of just the theological tenor and character of William Shedd. Like I said, he's old school Presbyterian, and I did fail to mention that little book that Manor put out many years ago called Calvinism Pure and Mixed, and he's responding to the controversies of Charles Briggs and other Presbyterians in the northern variety that were trying to change and calling for change in the Westminster Confession of Faith. J.B. Fesco has a great book called The Spirit of the Age that also addresses this 1903 amendment to the Westminster Confession. Of course, the conservative folks that came back in the 30s and after the OPC, the PCUSA, and other groups, of course, they adopted the original and made the course correction there, thankfully. But this is a great book that addresses that particular issue while it was going on. So kind of an interesting historical piece, too, there as well, Calvinism Pure Mix. But the dogmatic theology is the magnum opus, and by far and away, the brilliant work of William Shedd, the theological genius of William Shedd. And I'll just kind of pull out a couple things I think that are of most importance in his work in my reading of him so far. And I would really like to read all of his works as a whole, his entire canon, if you will, once I get the time. But all of his books are on my shelf, and I'm kind of starting to work through all of them slowly but surely. I think he's just such an incredible theologian. He's certainly one of the greatest in American, Protestant American history, I think. One of the most just lucid and clear, and at the same time powerful thinkers and I think teachers of God's truth. A great gospel preacher, you can tell by the way that he really just impresses truth upon you, your mind and your heart as you read him. Again, I wish I could have heard him preach because it seems so powerful just from reading it. But what really is the brilliance that I'm talking about? Well, one, I think he's brilliant in that he did not sense the need to write about everything. And that's really interesting, being a systematic theologian. That's kind of what it is. You're writing about everything, something about everything. And I think that there's a brilliance there, that there's a weakness there, but there's a brilliance there. He knew what he needed to say. He knew where the current culture was. He knew what was happening theologically in controversy, and he knew where he was going to make, to strike at the heart the most of what the gospel needed to be defended in culture and in the churches. And I think that's part of the brilliance of Shedd, is that he's not trying to say a little bit about everything. He's trying to say a whole lot about a few things. And I really appreciate that, because I think there's too many people that think, well, I'm going to preach the whole counsel of God, so I need to say a little bit of something about everything. Well, how about you do this? Preach the whole counsel of God, but mainly focus on what's needed the most in the moment, from moment to moment, season to season. And so in a lot of ways, he's a brilliant a preacher and a brilliant pastor, as he is a great theologian at the same time. So he says a whole lot about just a few things, really, and he really leaves a lot of things out, which is a part of the weakness of it. But I think it's kind of two-sided. It's brilliant that he spends so much time speaking about the realities of the atonement. It's brilliant that he spends so much time speaking about the holiness of God. It's incredible that he spends so much space and so much time writing on the doctrine of endless punishment. And so, and again, as an example, he spends less than, again, I don't know if this is a strength, but he only writes about 2 pages on heaven in this book. And he writes about 60 pages on hell. And again, he's not saying because that's the scope of what the Bible is saying. He's speaking into the culture. He's speaking into the church. He's speaking into the moment, into the need. He's defending doctrines that are under attack in his systematics. So that might not be exactly the same today, though actually I think it is. Why I think he's so relevant. So in the sense of brilliance, it's, I think, part of he really sharpened his sword towards a few things. And secondly, he is thoroughly, in the best sense, evangelical in the historical sense. He teaches evangelically everything. He spends time showing the pertinence and the urgency of the truth of the gospel and how they're connected to doctrines. And that's the hallmark of a great evangelical scholar, is that not they're just teaching doctrines and truth, they're connecting those truths to the witness of the church. And Shedd does that just, I think, magnificently. I think that's one of the reasons I love him most. It reminds me a lot of J.C. Ryle. And just there's an urgency to everything he says, not in the sense of each thing is of equal weight, but he connects the urgency of where it connects to the gospel, where it affects the gospel. And he's not, again, talking about the atonement and talking about justice of God and talking about holiness and talking about, eternal judgment. Those all have part and parcel of the gospel, the atonement being central, the other parts being connected deeply to it. So he's defending the gospel in his own day. I mean, you think of the patristic scholars that defended the gospel in their day in the 5th, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th centuries. They're defending the gospel as it came to the person and work of Christ. Who is Jesus? Well, he's not this third weird thing where human and divine come together and form some weird conglomeration, right? He doesn't have one will, he has two wills, right? This reality that he is both God and man. He doesn't just have one energy, he has two energies, right? In the sense of he's God and man. That's what Maximus Confessor defended in the 7th century. Notice they're not just defending theology, they're defending the gospel. How that connects to the gospel. If he's not God and man, he can't save us. So I think Shedd has that same principle in how he writes. There's something so pertinent and pressing. So he's thoroughly evangelical. He's extremely brilliant in choosing the doctrines that are most needed to advance in the day. So it's not really a timeless book in a sense. It's more of a timely systematic theology, I think, in my viewing and reading of it over time. And lastly, because of time here, he is speculative. So he does seem to spend a lot of time thinking through rational inferences of doctrines and things like this, and takes a lot from the tradition of Jonathan Edwards, where there's a lot of inferential, again, I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's certainly speculative in how he reasons through doctrines from Scripture. So there is certainly a highly rationalistic bent in William Shedd that is interesting. It does make for interesting theological reading, though sometimes you're like, I don't know if I can follow him there. I mean, the tradition view is certainly more of a Lutheran viewpoint, and again, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not grading it or something here. I'm simply saying he's taking some more approaches that Reformed scholars don't typically take. They take the creationist view. He takes the tradition view. He also takes the realistic reality of original sin instead of the representative reality of original sin. So he takes more of an Augustinian approach to how sin is transferred instead of the representative federal focus. And so again, it's interesting how he reasons biblically and rationally through those things. Then of course he also really engages the evolution of the time, and there's certainly an intense kind of battle with that during the period, and he really battles that too. So he is I think, brilliant theologian in the sense of his timeliness of how he approaches doctrine. He is old school Presbyterian, but he's also speculative and kind of in many ways very nuanced, very Edwardsian in that way, but he's not as fatalistic as I would say Jonathan Edwards is. I think that's a great weakness of Edwards. There is certainly an inherent kind of fatalism, though he says he's not, but there's always a leaning towards fatalism with Jonathan Edwards, and he's not like that. But he takes the speculative thoughts of Edwards, of the realistic views of original sin, certainly from Edwards. There is certainly, I think, a highly philosophical view on how he argues for doctrines, which also makes his reasoning so piercing and so potent, I think. So again, while there's some drawbacks with that kind of level of philosophical engagement, it also makes certain doctrines so incredibly potent, it's almost, you can't get around it. How incredibly powerful he argues for the doctrine of justice, of hell, and the doctrine of the need for a substitutionary atonement, the rationale for that, the intrinsic holiness of God and the justice of God, and how all those connect together on the cross, of course, in the final judgment. So there's a lot to be said about William Shedd. I think he is certainly one of the brightest lights of American theology in the Protestant vein, and certainly one of the greatest Presbyterian theologians in America, in American history. He is certainly someone to be wrestled with, and maybe argued with a little bit, but someone that there's a lot to learn from, I think, when it comes especially to a handful of very important doctrines in our day that concern the gospel, the substitutionary atonement, the reality of hell, the holiness of God, the importance of resisting evolutionary theory. I think these things are also very pertinent in our day, as they were in the late 19th century as well. All right, hope this helped you a little bit, exposing you more to the theology of William G.T. Shedd. All right, signing off.